Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Well, hello and welcome everyone to this edition of 4K Punk 2022. We've had to take it online again due to the unpredictability of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. But yeah, this event was originally intended to be the fifth annual Mark Fisher Memorial Lecture, but it's now hosted externally by Urbanomic in support of Goldsmiths UCU's ongoing strike action. You can find a link below to support the strike with the strike fund, and it's just in the description as well. So yeah, celebrating 5 years since the publication of Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie, I'm going to pass you on to Matt to give a little more of an intro about what you'll hear tonight.
Yeah. So yeah, as Natasha mentioned, it's 5 years since publication of The Weird and the Eerie, which is something that we kind of really wanted to celebrate, and I can't think of a better way to do that really than by the North Sea, which I think we're all going to hear for the first time tonight, actually. But I know Robin is something that Robin Mackay's been working on for quite a few years now, and yeah, it's kind of always, I think it's always, at least it's always been in our mind as something that we wanted to sort of try and celebrate through for K-Punk. And despite some things falling apart, it kind of feels like things have nicely come together this week. So yeah, we're joined tonight by Robin Mackay, who's a philosopher and director of the publishing house Urbanomic, which aims to engender interdisciplinary thinking and production. And Robin is joined by Amy Ireland, who's a theorist and experimental writer from Melbourne, who's a member of the... No, is that right? Am I getting that right?
For a time, I was from Melbourne.
You were?
Originally from outback Australia, a town that no one knows about.
I just realised that I hallucinated Melbourne as the word modernity from your bio. Anyway, but you're also a member of the techno-materialist transfeminist collective Laboria Carbonics. Yeah, so without further ado, I kind of wanted to pass over to you two. I know you wanted to introduce this before we dive into things.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt. Yeah, I wanted to say a few words before we start, but not too much. Yeah, so what you're going to hear is an audio piece that I've been working on and off for 5 years now. It's great to air it as part of 4K Punk, which is like a tradition that's I appreciate a great deal, and the spirit behind it. And thanks very much to Matt for organising it, because Matt, you know as well as anyone just how long I've been working on this and kept promising that it was going to be finished, and never quite got there. So giving me a deadline has been absolutely fantastic for me. But doing it as part of this event, which is a way to every year think about Mark and think about his work, I felt like I had to say something about in what way this piece relates to Mark. In what way is it about Mark? It's not really necessarily about him in a simple way. And in fact, since I've worked on it for so long and I've kind of layered so much stuff in it, it's impossible that it would just be about one thing anyway. But in terms of thinking about Mark and his legacy, I think it's a good thing that it wasn't released earlier, because I haven't really felt comfortable about it until now anyway. And I don't want it to add to the kind of hagiography of Mark Fisher, this kind of huge, towering figure. It's not a representation of Mark. It's not really connected to the public figure of Mark Fisher as a kind of campaigning political prophet or a hero. And that figure of Mark Fisher that exists in public is something that increasingly I find unrecognizable, and it's not about that figure really. Obviously I spent a lot of time with Mark in what was the most kind of intense period of my life at Warwick University with the CCRU. And for me, when I think about him, what I think about is his immense energy. That energy at the time, he could be quite fierce. Like that energy could come out in like coruscating critiques of your position or what you happen to have just said thoughtlessly. It could also express itself in like an out of control, over enthusiasm and speculation. But it also, I think, was expressed in his depression, because I think of depression as being a kind of turning of your energy back on yourself. It's a kind of an expression of excess in a way, depression. And obviously he could really kind of be punishing on himself in that way. But what I remember about him most is that just as a person who is caught up in creative ferment and energy, who is constantly thinking about how to put the conditions in place for production, for making things, for engendering microcultures. He was a connector. He was someone who loved making things. He was a cultural synthesizer. And if I think of like a figurative image of Mark at work, it would be like him sitting on his living room floor with books and papers and records and stuff like strewn around him, and almost imagine him like creating this spider web between all of these things in order to make something new. So that kind of connecting and making something out of the materials at your disposal, not as a leisure activity, but as a necessity for survival, absolutely, for Mark. That's really the key thing that he means to me. And so, yeah, when Mark died, I almost immediately, I went back to this box that I have, which has these like loads of videotapes and papers and stuff from this project that we embarked on, which never really happened. And it's about this town Dunwich, which is on the east coast of England. Over the centuries, Dunwich has declined from being a huge city, a trading port, to being a tiny little village which only has one street, and gradually the whole town has gone down the cliff into the sea with the erosion from the North Sea. It's fairly well known in England. The legend is that because all the churches have gone down under the sea, you can hear sometimes the bells of the churches ringing underwater. And it's definitely then, in that sense, it's like part of that weird and eerie geography that that Mark went on to investigate and explore on Vanishing Land, and in many of his blog posts, of course. So Mark and I both went on holiday to Dunwich as children. I remember very well being taken there and being like, why are we here? What's here? There's literally nothing there. So we had this plan to talk about the Dunwich story and to splice it together with bits of the CCRU lore, the characters out of the CCRU writings and Lovecraft material as well, and make a kind of hyperstitional documentary. The key reference here was this passing phrase that comes up in CCRU writings when they talk about the Tridentitarian Church of Dagon, which is just one of these things that's thrown in and no one knows what it is. And that was then kind of to become the core of this this documentary. So in 2001, Mark and I and my then partner Ruth went on a car journey from London to Dunwich, a very, very long drive, in fact. And we did some filming and we interviewed a few people. We obviously really didn't know what we were doing. None of us have made a documentary or made a film or anything. But we did these filmed interviews, and we filmed the beach and the last gravestones up on the cliff and stuff like that. And then the project never went any further than that. And my friendship with Mark then kind of fell back into the pattern it had been in since Warwick, which was these long periods of non-communication. And retrospectively, now looking back at it, I can see there was something at stake in that attempt to get back together and to make something. It was obviously already a kind of attempt at recovering something that had been lost. So then when he died, I went back to the project, And for me, it became like a focal point for thinking about, for figuring out how to go on, or what to think, or how to live in the face of this ending. You know, when it became this thing which would now definitively never happen. And I realised that throughout this long period when we hadn't really spoken much, in the back of my mind, I'd always assumed and thought there was going to be a time when all of this is going to come back together, when we're going to work together, we're going to be in that same state of creative production of that incredibly intense period. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, like, part of the reason why I held on to it so long was like, I wasn't sure whether I was allowed to talk about Mark like that, because of the nature of our relationship was so kind of broken in some sense. But I have to say, you know, anyone who knew Mark back in those days in the 90s will tell you, even if you met him once you got to know Mark, once you'd engaged with him, he would always be an interlocutor. Like, he's always in my head. Mark has never left to this day. You know, I come across things and they remind me of conversations, or I'm like, I wonder what Mark would think about that. And like 20 years later, I've written texts that were based on like one remark that he made in a conversation from 1995. So he's always been there, like he's always been someone who I'm talking to. He was a constant presence, but the reality, making that presence a reality and working together again, was always this thing deferred to a virtual time, which I thought, I didn't even think it, I just assumed that's going to happen. Things are going to come back. So, you know, you might say, why was the friendship like that if I was so fond of Mark and he was such an important part of my life, really like a pivotal influence? And part of the answer to that question is depression, and that's partly what this is about as well. The last phone call that I had with Mark a week before he died was about depression. I called him up because I'd finally reached the point after years and years of saying to myself, look, you're suffering from depression, and you know, if you don't do something about it, it's going to get worse and worse. And it was already pretty bad. I mean, as anyone with depression will tell you, you survive and you keep doing things like a normal person, but you're really distanced from the world, you know, and kind of falling further. And so that the last conversation I had with him, I was actually like asking him for advice, like about should I go to the doctor? Should I get pills? Because that was the thing I always like was afraid of. I didn't want to take medication. And I remember he was really shocked. Like, he said to me, "What, you're depressed? How long have you been depressed for?" And I was like, I don't know, 2 decades or something. And he was kind of taken aback by this, and we had a conversation which ended with saying, well, we should get together sometime soon. So partly this thing is about also the fact that I feel like we were in these black holes in different places, not communicating. So in the wake of all that, doing By the North Sea, going back to this project and trying to make something of it was like an attempt to do something with Mark. It's like the times when I was writing it, it was with him. It wasn't about him. In the interim, I think about 2010, I'd already kind of gone back to the project and written a fictionalized version of some of it. So I'd already revisited it again. And all of these layers are kind of then got compacted into what became the final thing. So it's lots of things at once. It's a massive block of grief that I've been carrying around with me for 5 years. It's trying to think about the conditions of production for making something out of nothing. And of course, there isn't anything at Dunwich. It literally is just the beach and the sea and the cafe. And so when I was writing it in those truly desolate months after his death, but which were always also a kind of awakening, like there was a kind of lucidity to them. And obviously, like in your book, you talk about this, Matt. So when I was writing it, I get these little sparks at some moments when I've written something, I thought, yeah, Mark would like that. And even now, like, when I listen to it now, there's moments when I can imagine Mark doing his like delighted little laugh just at the way that two things fit together, or a certain way that something's said, a phrasing or something. So to me, it's been a way of being with him and of asking all of the questions that moment posed to me. So sorry, I've said too much really, but the last thing is, I suppose, just to say I wanted to make it kind of pulpy and maybe even a bit cheesy in parts, and I don't want to give people the impression that it's like really maudlin and miserable. Mark's work on depression is really important, and it's important to talk about it, but also it's important to not make people even more miserable in January. So hopefully it's not all just like sadness and woe. It is ultimately about some really tough questions, but it doesn't answer them in a definitively negative way. Is there anything else that I should say?
No, I think I mean, I've got some questions for you, but a lot of them have to do with the content of it, and I think it would be better just to listen to it first. And then we can talk about some of the things that come through when you listen to it.
So just on the format of it, it's about an hour long. It was meant to be a film, but if it was a film, I would have still been here like 20 years later. I did originally hope that it would be played live, but I think it's kind of good that it's being broadcast like this, because it's more like, it's kind of something like a radio play afflicted by ontological rot, but also with kind of bits and pieces from like the eerie English 70s TV and all that kind of stuff that Mark loved so much. So yeah, I tried to work with this concept of the eerie and the spectral, but also with kind of a pulpy feel. And yeah, it's kind of a bit fragmentary maybe, but that's how it is.
Is it useful to kind of talk about like the elements that constitute it before we listen to it? Because it's drawing from original recordings that you and Mark made in 2001. Yeah. And then it's got parts that you wrote later, and I mean, I don't.
So the main narrative that I'm speaking was written in 2017, and yes, there are pieces, the kind of last remaining fragments of the bits and pieces that we filmed and recorded in Dunwich in 2001, and then there are these other hyperstitional narratives which kind of produce a conceptual space within which everything is embedded.
Yeah,
or
so
something like that.
There's multiple layers.
Yeah.
There's multiple layers of the actual iterations of the project, but then there's multiple layers of like moments in the history of the investigation of Dunwich in the piece as well. Yeah. But I think it's, as I said before, best to let the piece speak for itself, and then we can talk about what's going on.
Yeah, sorry for talking for so long already.
No, I think that you gave it the best introduction that you possibly could.
Okay, so...
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing, Robin.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I will say, on a note of housekeeping too, if people have their own questions, we will keep an eye on the YouTube chat, so feel free to put them in there and we can ask some of those at the end. But
Great, well, thanks everyone for coming to listen to it, and I think we're going to shut off Skype now, and hopefully after a few moments silence it should begin. Okay. We can't have grid mode.
Can't have what?
Hi, Matt.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
I'm just noticing the lag of me looking gormlessly at the screen while we. Anyway, that's how we go. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think, along with probably everybody else in the chat, still sort of decompressing.
Yeah.
Which feels nicely fitting, actually, to have gone down to the depths and not come up too fast. But
sorry.
I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions. And please do feel free to put those in the YouTube chat.
Yeah.
But for now, I know that you and Amy had some sort of questions prepared. So happy to sort of hand over to you again, and we can field some extra questions if they come up.
Amy's got like 20 A4 sheets of questions.
Amazing.
Oh my God! Like, you can't imagine what it feels like though to just have officially let go of this like almost hysterical feeling of relief and.
You've been obsessing over it for years.
Well, I haven't, because I kind of forgot about it for long periods and then came back to it. But I'm really glad that I never let it go now. Like in the last couple of days when I've been doing the final mix and feeling like it's actually working, I've been like literally laughing and crying at the same time, and just thinking about Mark hearing some of these bits and like, how much you'd like them.
It's made me cry several times as well. When you first sent me the script, like, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years ago. I got a bit teary reading it, and then last night I listened to this by myself in a dark room, and kind of made me cry at the end. That final repetition of the line from Mark's email about the next few years being crucial compressed so much into them. And I think the two, what to me seem like the two main themes of the piece, are both contained in those lines. Basically, I mean, it's definitely a work of loss and mourning, but it's also about escape. So I wanted just sort of to start off really broadly, if you wanted to kind of comment about those two themes in the piece.
Okay. I don't know what to say about that.
Well, there's like, there's three kind of like levels of narrative, right?
Yeah.
There's Stillwell writing to Templeton, and Templeton's assistant narrating the journey to Dunwich sometime in like the, I guess, mid-20th century. And then there's you and Mark going to Dunwich and interviewing Stuart and Michael? No, who's the other?
Morgan. Yeah.
And then there's you in 2017, just after Mark's death, reflecting on all of this. But in each of those levels, like even all the way back to Stillwell and Templeton's assistant, there's this sense of something that's been lost. And also everyone in each of these levels is searching for the third mode of time, which is kind of synonymous with escape.
So the different levels, it's quite complex because narratively the different levels are placed in different time periods, but there's also a kind of embedding, like there's a series of shells really, or a depth system or a system of intensity, but they're also, like, in the making of it, they kind of came from different time periods. So there's those interviews. So that's the people that you hear there. That's Stuart Bacon, this guy, who's a diver who runs Suffolk Underwater Studies. We interviewed him in Orford, near Dunwich. And then Morgan Keynes, who I was saying the other day, like, it's incredible that this guy is actually called Morgan Keynes, because it sounds like someone that we'd made up like out of a In the Mouth of Madness type of pulp film script, but that's his name, Morgan Keynes. And he's or at the time anyway, was the keeper of the museum at Dunwich. So that was the stuff that I retrieved out of my archives. And I'd add, I'm really bad at keeping archives. Like usually I just tape over stuff. So it's quite lucky I still had some of it. I obviously felt like it should be held on to. And then in the interim, like between when we did that and when Mark died, I'd obviously gone back to it another time and written this kind of fictionalized version of our trip there, in which Mark is like Mark is Templeton and I'm his bewildered assistant, which is kind of I think it was me like reflecting on the feeling that I know a lot of people shared like around Mark, that he's one of those people who is just like going too fast for you to follow a lot of the time. I mean, he was a great teacher and he was a great explainer, but you know, when his mind was really like on full tilt, then yeah, you really had to run fast to keep up with him. So it's a kind of humorous, fictionalized version of that in the vein of like Conan Doyle type of story. And then, if you like, at the centre of this shell system, there's Stilwell, and who's kind of involved in this exchange of letters with someone who's told her about the Dunwich in England. And I suppose that's the level of the conceptual thinking through of these questions about time. And then on the outer level, you've got me reflecting on the trip in 2001. So each level becomes a kind of iteration of the same struggle. You got Stilwell in 1949, Templeton in, I think it's 1968, then you've got 2001, and then you've got 2017. And in each case, it's an iteration of the same battle between modes of time, or an attempt to find the third mode of time, which is neither just the continuation of the same monotonous sameness, nor a definitive cataclysmic ending. So that's like the key to it, really, is at the beginning, these three modes of time. And interestingly, we had both modes of time, because we had what Mark calls the years of the period of isolation, you know, when after this massive intensity of CCIU, it was like we've gone back to normal life. And I think everyone who's involved was kind of in this state of bewilderment and not knowing how to exist outside of that reality in a sense. But then we also had 9/11, which was like this cataclysmic shift where everything suddenly was different, and it kind of swept a whole world away. So in a sense, like that quest, that struggle to find that third mode of time is positioned between those two, which we were actually experiencing at the time.
It's also like heavily connected or associated with the sea in the piece, the third mode of time.
Yeah.
And the, Stilwell and Templeton's search for the Dagon cultists, and their connection to the sea, as well as this kind of historical narrative about the port of Dunwich slowly eroding and the churches being washed into the sea. And also, I mean, that kind of final beautiful image of Stuart Bacon's about the diver free diving. He talks about neutral buoyancy, so not free diving, but diving with just a diver's lamp in the pitch black waters above the church and not knowing which way is up or down, and so swimming in this kind of spiral formation also seems to be part of this kind of liquid motif that's connected to the...
Yeah.
Do you want to... Have you got anything to sort of say about the role of the sea? Or is it something that kind of just comes out of the fact that Dunwich's history is so connected to the sea?
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea of the sea, I suppose, being something that's effectively, as an entity, escapes those modes of time. You know, the sea can be cataclysmic, it can be deadly, it can be inhospitable to life, it can be destructive, but it's also like this living system that breathes, that cycles, that in some sense stays the same and is constant. And so maybe like it also contains this third mode of time.
There's also like, I mean, I guess it kind of alludes to all the ideas of regression, thalassic regression, and Lovecraft's people from Innsmouth.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I mean, the idea is obviously like if this kind of Dagonite cult that Lovecraft describes in kind of veiled terms, I'm just going to say on the screen here, director's commentary. This is really funny. I found this in the box the other day. So when we wrote to people asking if they want to be in the documentary, we made up this pretend company called Hyperstition Productions. That was the first time that I used this picture, which later became the Urbanomic logo. Yeah.
That's 9 years before. Is it 9 years before Urbanomic was an official entity?
And it says on the letter, it's an artistic project, and it's like saying in veiled terms, we may well manipulate all of the footage out of all recognition. So the Dunwich, the idea is like if this Dagonite thing, this thing is like linked in Lovecraft to fear, right? To a fear of miscegenation, of mixing, to a fear of a racialized fear of regression in some parts, and with a fear of the countryside as well, like a fear of these simple folk who have their old ways and all that stuff. And it just seemed like if that was going to happen anywhere in England, it would have to be Dunwich. Like all the conditions are in place there for that kind of belief system to arise, because people are literally like seeing everything just fall into the sea year upon year upon year.
And there's actually like a sort of link. I mean, I'm assuming this is real and it's not just something that you invented for the purposes of the piece.
What, Dunwich?
No, but so you have this kind of story, or this part of the story narrated by S.T. Joshi, the actual S.T. Joshi,
yeah, right. Yeah.
World famous Lovecraft scholar,
mm-hmm.
about Lovecraft purportedly owning a copy of Poems with Swinburne by the North Sea, which is set, or it's about Dunwich.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously Dunwich comes to is a named place in Lovecraft's fiction, and then you also have the kind of whole Innsmouth story as well.
Yes.
So there's a literary history, a real literary history that actually makes this connection.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I don't think that the part that Joshi's reading out there is from his own like glossary on Lovecraft, and I think he says there, you know, we actually don't know whether Lovecraft, he doesn't explicitly discuss it anywhere, but he had the poem in his possession, and it seems unimaginable that he would not have known about this kind of melancholy story of the sea, and that it wasn't connected in some way to Innsmouth. But, you know, we just set out to kind of make all of those connections concrete and to realise them in this hyperstitional form.
What about the do you want to talk about the Dagon cultists, the recording of the Nomo chant?
That's really another time period. Again, I guess that's from like 1999, 2000. That's taken from the CCIU's Syzygy project in Beaconsfield.
So it's an actual recording of members of CCIU incanting Nomo.
Yeah, chanting the evocation of Dagon, the fish god. Also, of course, there's a massive historical part to it, which isn't really explored by the North Sea, which is to do with the fish and Christianity and the actual historical stuff about Dagon, and that's also part of it. There are also other historical things about Dunwich, like you hear Morgan says at one point, it's where Christianity first came into England. So it's very important in terms of religion. And it also had this really fascinating kind of geopolitical history, because there's a spit of land that comes off the edge of the east coast there, and the fate of Dunwich was essentially bound to the action of the North Sea kind of combing this spit of land downwards over years and centuries and moving it around. So it's like this tentacle that then closes over the port of Dunwich and makes the port absolutely useless. And linked with that, there was a huge conflict between Dunwich and Walberswick, which is like the next port along. And there was huge political controversy, manoeuvrings there. And also the fact that wherever you have a city that used to be very populous and has become less so, you have like the political scandal of rotten boroughs. So you have too many MPs for too few people. So that happened there too. So there's all sorts of historical stories that we dug up that aren't entirely, that aren't really gone into at all.
Apart from the obvious Lovecraft connection, what made you and Mark both decide that day that Dunwich was going to be the place that you should go to try and make this documentary? Is it because it was near to Felixstowe, or? I think it was just something that had come up in conversation, because Mark obviously had an interest in the literary heritage of the East Coast, which is what On Vanishing Land explores in a much kind of broader way. And he had childhood memories of being in Suffolk. So I think that's why he ended up living there, is because that was a place he remembered as having this kind of eerie magic that obviously was a huge influence on him from his childhood. And as I said, I used to go on holiday there too. I grew up in Suffolk. And so we would discuss stuff like M.R. James, and particularly the 60s TV production of Whistle and I'll Come to You, which features two locations, both of which were places I went on holiday as a kid, at Dunwich and Waxham Sands in Norfolk. And so I guess we both had these other like ulterior attractions to go back and rediscover this place. And this is like, the more that I think about this, the more that I think about the piece, the more that I discover there's so many movements of return and repetition and reiteration, all kind of tangled up together, and hopefully some of that comes across in the piece. Let's talk about the Millennium for a moment.
Yeah.
Because it was 2001 when you drove to Dunwich with Mark. And it's kind of, a well-known historical observation that throughout history, in the decades leading up to the Millennium, there's often a kind of like generalized apocalyptic mood, where people, apocalyptic in sort of the sense of the word as like a revealing or like a great change.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a catastrophe that kind of renews everything. So it's kind of both positive and negative. And I know that CCRU was kind of very much kind of caught up in this idea, and there was a lot of fetishization of Y2K.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a big part of like the sort of fervor of the 1990s cyberculture in the UK as well. But obviously Y2K didn't really, nothing major happened. It was a little bit of a, I suppose, as the Millennium often seems to be, like a little bit of a disappointment.
Yeah.
And it was also, I guess, a few years after CCRU had properly disbanded, even in its unofficial capacity. You were no longer at Warwick. Mark had finished his PhD and moved on. So there's that kind of like post-apocalypse, post-millennium kind of mood of maybe like, I guess that's a different register of loss in the piece. Do you want to kind of, I don't know, say a few words about about this for both you and Mark, because it's like it looks like you were doing this project partially to me as a way of trying to rediscover or reclaim some of that creative intensity that you both experienced working with each other in the 90s.
And so first of all, I left Warwick before really like all of the major CCRU work that you find in the CCRU writings took place. So I'd already kind of been out of that scene, and I think in the last years of the Millennium, it got increasingly intense, and everyone was kind of scarred by it in a way, and also, as I said, a bit bewildered afterwards about, well, you know, people just went off to do their own thing. What happened? Did anything happen? So in a sense, like the Millennium is like it's the same structure. You know, did something happen or not? The hilarious thing about the CCRU take on the Millennium, of course, is like the more it seemed like it didn't happen, the more suspicious it is. So of course something happened, but we don't yet know what it is. But there was that sense of, I mean, I didn't feel it at first because I kind of had enough of being at university. I wanted to go and do something else, and I went and I moved to London. I got a job. I was kind of okay, but it crept up on me slowly, and it was only in the years after Mark's death that I realised that everyone else who was involved had felt the same thing. But yeah, so there was this sense of what happened. Maybe nothing happened. We've got to get on with whatever we're doing, and there's nothing you can do about it. And sometimes in life there are those periods like you can't do anything about it. And then there are these moments, terrible moments sometimes, but moments of lucidity. And one of the most important things that I say in the piece is right at the beginning about the acuteness of loss and the loss of acuteness. And the fact that what I was trying to do in writing this, like immediately in that space of just utter desolation, is to try to put down a marker to say, this is how it feels when everything else has been like shoved out of your life, when you have this harrowingly lucid perspective on things. And that's, in a sense, was like part of the function of writing it for me. And it you know, the positive thing to say about it is that it also worked. You know, it shouldn't take someone's death for you to be able to make the changes that you need to in your own life, but that moment was absolutely huge to me, and you know, it absolutely changed my perspective on everything. So yeah, putting down these markers is a way of reminding yourself that that mode of time also exists, that mode of being absolutely in this lucidity of knowing what really matters, and of knowing that what seems to be happening can't possibly be happening.
This is all kind of compacted into those two words that you utter close to the end, before we hear Mark resurrected, and which was also kind of a like an operator for CCRU, the two words, and yet.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah,
I mean, it feels like for me that that's the function of those words in the piece as well.
I think that's for some reason that stands out to me as being like a really characteristic CCRU phrase, that if there's something with the power of the AOE exists, which attempts to organise all of history from the beginning to end so it's absolutely sealed, then obviously in a sense, even to attempt that enterprise means you've got such immense power that you must very nearly be able to succeed. And it's the and yet that prizes open this small crack of possibility, this tiny hairline crack in the system that's otherwise absolutely homogeneous and sealed, i.e. the system of time. And that is what I needed to do at that moment. So I needed the "and yet" desperately.
Do you want to, I might just ask one sort of last thing,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe Matt can kind of look at the questions that people have been asking in the chat. So I think there might be a few.
There's Mark talking to Stuart Bacon in the museum there.
So just after you say "and yet" in the piece, we hear Mark's voice reading out his email that he sent to you in 2016 about the Dunwich project, which obviously, I mean, he wasn't, you know, it's an email, so there's no way you'd have a recording of him reading it. So do you want to talk about, like, the appearance of Mark in the piece?
Right. So I built what I call the Markotron, which is a synthetic voice, a synthetic Mark voice. And it was the thing that was most difficult to achieve, and it actually took me years of like asking people to help me and no one helped me, and then like trying to research the software myself and working out how to do it. Luckily I worked with Florian Hecker on the Fawn project in 2016, in which we used a synthetic voice, so I kind of understood the procedure, but it took me a long time to do it. As you know, we kind of we talked a little bit before this about whether I should give a trigger warning or something, or like say that it's a bit disturbing, because for me, like the first time I got it to work, it really was like
Eerie.
It's not exactly frightening, but yeah, just eerie, but in such a overpowering way, and especially so in that when you do it with a kind of incomplete data set, I mean, really you need a huge amount of data to do it seamlessly. So when you do it with a limited data set, you get these kind of stutterings, which you hear at the beginning there, and faults and little bits of phrases, and it's absolutely harrowing, because it literally is like you're pulling someone up out of non-existence and they're merging. So I kind of wondered whether I should warn people about it, but the one thing that carried me through and made me keep doing that was that I was thinking all the time, this is horrible, this is like macabre and eerie and awful, and Mark would have loved it. Like he would have just loved, he would have been so excited by this. So that's the thing that kind of made me keep it in and gave me the faith that it's okay to do that, that kind of little bit of spectral resurrection.
The email itself, it's kind of important that it appears in the piece as well, because it's in that sort of typical style that Mark blogged in. It seems that on one level just kind of like really banal and quotidian, but on another he's saying these really profound things. Yeah. Which are in a way like definitive for...
One thing I like about it is like you have all of these different narratives going on, and you have this depth and all the stuff about the sea and so on, and then that bit kind of, that very last thing that he says seems a bit jarring and like out of place and prosaic, when he's saying, you know, people of the elite ruling class always have confidence in what they're doing and think it's worth doing, but for us to even think for a moment that it's okay for us to be doing what we're doing is a huge achievement. And that's kind of what I was saying at the beginning about this idea of, you know, really we're both people who need to be making things and connecting things and to be getting excited about things as a matter of survival, not because, you know, it's a bit of fun or we want to get on a podcast or whatever. So I kind of like the fact that that bit doesn't quite fit, and yet in a way it's kind of saying everything about the whole piece. Is that how do you get to feel the sense of entitlement that what you're doing is real when it's always so precarious, and or it so often seems like it's nothing, or like you're just working with sand and it's just going to all crumble and fall through your fingers.
Do you want to add anything to our conversation, or should we like get Matt to see what people have been?
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, we can do that. Are you still there, Matt?
I am still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Chat is being quite slow this evening.
Yeah.
Well, not slow, but at least as far as questions are concerned.
Yeah.
But
Cool.
I do have my own questions.
Uh-huh.
Because I think it's really interesting that, well, not so much interesting as I guess I can relate to that anxiety. I think everyone can relate to that anxiety of Mark becoming not well. I guess it's you said at the start about not contributing to this hagiography,
Yeah.
and yet at the same time there's a reticence, maybe a natural reticence that comes from using him and deploying him as a tool, almost as if like as a puppet. But it's kind of I've been sort of before you started tonight, and going back and looking at a bunch of like Mark's really old essays, like CCRU era, when he was kind of in that Ballardian Burroughs moment of you never really knew what was Mark's what was Mark and what was someone else. He wouldn't so much cite other people in his essays as much as like sample them. And I know that you both wrote that essay together in sort of the mid-90s on homophobia, where I guess there's that it's an exploration of that tension in sampling, that if you're sampling something in that kind of friction-free space of postmodernity, that's kind of the problem, right? It's citing things in tension and putting them in tension and allowing that tension to be there. That's kind of what's most interesting. But I don't know, I guess I couldn't do that awful thing of saying it's more a comment than a question, but do you think that there's, I guess, how do you feel about that now looking back, with where this being so much indebted to that CCRU time, where that tension of sampling rather than citing kind of takes on a different energy maybe? And I guess I wondered how you felt about that in making this project.
I mean, the whole project was just, all the time that I've been doing it was absolutely riddled with self-doubt, and like I could have given up at any moment, but also like it's just something that I couldn't let go of at all. And I don't know if I ever questioned myself about that, insofar as long as I suppose the reason why it took so long to do was I needed to feel like that it added something, and that it was an integral piece of work itself that connected to all of those things it was sampling and using, and that it wasn't, as long as I'm confident that I'm not betraying any of that, then the question doesn't really arise. I am quite sensitive about what it means to use Mark in various ways. You know, some of it's inevitable, and some of it's just like general social media stupidity. Some of it is people who are very upset, and you know, not people who have struggles and problems, and who Mark really helped, and who therefore have kind of erected him into something heroic and like a kind of savior almost. Yeah, I don't know. To me, the most important thing was to be with him as the person I knew him as, and to share with him again all of the things that kind of bonded us together and that we got excited about together. And like when I listen to it, and there's that Lovecraft quote where he's going like hysterical about the frog people, and it's like half ichthyaic, half batrachian. And I just remember like just saying that phrase with Mark over and over again to each other, and just like being hysterical about it because it's such a brilliant phrase. And those kind of like little things, and recalling those things to myself, and being faithful to them, really is that's the only thing I cared about. Like, I know that this is something that I made with him and not about him and not using him, and that was really all that mattered. Like, that I got to the point when I was sure that was the case. And as far as like, I don't want to kind of instruct anyone what to do, but I think, you know, the only way to be faithful to Mark's work and his legacy is to do something else with it, to move it on, to do your own work and not to constantly dwell on it. I mean, obviously what I've done is precisely the opposite, because I had to do this to, you know, to move through something. I had to do it. But I think in terms of honouring his legacy, it's really important that he doesn't get turned into, you know, a doctrinal body, or, you know, we don't end up analysing his shopping lists and stuff.
There's two questions in the chat that maybe dovetail into this. Mattie is here from Beyond the Grave.
Oh, cool.
Who was asking, I'm going to fold these together because I think maybe they're relevant together. Do you have any particular fond memories of your time at the CCIU with Mark, and how do you feel about its resurgence? But I guess Sullivan's also in the chat, who's asking where you feel this complexity of method, the kind of time travel, will take you next. So maybe there's a sort of backward-looking question and one and a forward trajecting counterpoint.
Well, I kind of like to say that I don't care what people think about it. To answer Simon's question first, I'd like to think I don't care what people think about it, and in a sense I don't. Like, I'm really happy to have got it into a form that I feel is finished. But, you know, I'm kind of interested, because all the time when I was doing it, I sent the script to so many people and everyone just didn't reply. They were obviously just like, oh God, this is like this grief-stricken buffoon who thinks he's going to make a documentary film. I just say nothing. So, you know, I never had any, apart from Amy, who's really helped me to shape the script at the beginning, and we were always in communication about it. I never really got any feedback about it. And so I'm kind of interested if people think that it's something that's not just a kind of a mess of fragmentary weirdness, then it's not like a method I can choose to apply. It's just how reality appears to me. So I guess I would go on to do more of it. Yeah, that's true. Lisa's saying chronosis. Yeah, my contribution to chronosis is maybe a similar thing. It's kind of about recapitulation and
I saw Lisa also asked about the soundtrack, which I'm kind of also curious about the what were the sounds we were hearing? How were those? I mean, I'm assuming that they're your own sort of synthesis. It's really interesting. Well, to me, narcissistically anyway, because this leads into the question of like how the whole thing got made, the actual process. So all of the music was done by me, except for the bits in the documentary sections, which were like obviously had to be cheesy library music. And I should actually find the guy who made that and thank him. That's kind of like a free download dramatic documentary soundtrack. But all the rest of it was done by me, again, like over this long period. And the interesting thing is, I never discarded anything. So I'd come back to it like after a year, and I'd do another sound, and that sound would become a part of it. And then that would get shaped when I added another sound. And it's basically the same way that I write. It's a kind of sculpture.
Like I don't ever plan anything. I have all these elements that I want to include, and I put them together and I gradually scrunch them together until they form something that looks like it should be there. So yeah, all of those different kind of parts of the soundtrack all just arrange themselves over a long period into the right shape. And one thing that I do, one faculty that I think I do have, at least for myself, is I recognize when something's right. I don't necessarily know how to make it right, but if I sit for 5 years and move bits forward and backwards, then I arrive at some bits which I think that's exactly right. And those are the bits that make me really happy in the piece, when in the kind of movement between the different sounds. But I suppose I did have some preconceptions, because like, for instance, that kind of furtive pizzicato sound, I always wanted to have that in the Templeton bit, because it was kind of just on the edge of cheesy and silly, but I think it works really well. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know what the question was there.
We've got another one from Supermarks, which is regarding the disappointment dissipation of the Millennium. Do you think there's any sort of validity or pulling on the actual advent of the Millennium by the idea of the short 20th century?
I don't understand that question. Sorry.
Not sure I do either of those.
What's in what sense? The short 20th century? Yeah, sorry, I don't know what that means.
Maybe there can be a clarification.
Yeah, if there's a clarification.
But I guess that's true. There was I guess there's a piece that Mark wrote about the CCIU, maybe, that was called Y2K Positive, and I guess this is part of that whole. Well, I guess it's a kind of longing for this. I guess maybe the idea that something is going to change is powerful in itself as a kind of hyperstition almost, or potential, rather than the idea of it is more interesting than the actuality, whatever that turned out to be.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, how that relates to, I mean, either way, it's interesting. But I guess I guess it's a series of. I feel like it's part of that same sort of tension, right? That the undecidability of that's the thing that's to be held on to. And I guess you have that here, right, where you're talking about this quite explicitly about the impossibility of finishing this thing or giving it a certain wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
But that's maybe the power that I guess is essential to the piece. But I guess a lot of Mark's work too, he often wrote about that really explicitly.
Yeah. I was going to mention one other thing about the soundtrack that I remembered, that I also had in mind another huge favourite of Mark's, John Carpenter, like those films where every time I go to a movie now, I'm like, why are they using all this like massively lush, what's basically movie library music for everything, all the time, like there's always music. Just fucking shut up for a bit. And then you go back to like those Carpenter films, they're absolutely magical. Like he's just playing one mono synth and there'll be no music for ages, and then you'll just get like this repeating pattern. So I absolutely didn't succeed in doing that, but that was part of where some of the music came from, was like thinking about it in that minimalistic way, and as like a movie soundtrack type of thing.
Lisa's also asking, I guess throwing into context, there's Mark's piece with Justin, Steve's work with Audience, and now your piece. They all share this sense of docufiction. Do you think of Chris Marker as the immediate precursor or perhaps inspiration elsewhere?
Yeah. I had a really interesting conversation with Steve actually at the weekend about this. And yes, obviously Marker is a massive influence. The thing about Marker though is that his work is also about the relation between the text and the image, right? That what Marker does incredibly well And what Adam Curtis manages to do passably well is to produce a tension between image and word. So you'll hear something mentioned and the image is sort of something completely different, and then later on the image which calls back to what's been said appears. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And that's what I would have liked to have done with this if I made a film version. And maybe now I've finished the audio, I can just like promise myself never to touch the audio and try and do some image work with it. I don't know. But yeah, that's part of the influence. Of course, there's the Glenn Gould, The Idea of North, is the kind of originary audio essay. But what we were saying was it's kind of crazy how little this medium has been explored, really. So we're living in a world where there's literally like hundreds of thousands of podcasts which are just two guys talking shit to each other. And I'm not putting them down because I listen to them as well. But there's all that audio material out there. And then on the other hand, listeners in the UK will know what I mean when I talk about Radio 4. Radio 4 plays like it's a very generic kind of production that always sounds the same. It always has the same people in it. And it's generally quite boring and not very adventurous. So there's this massive open space for producing audio work that's more challenging to the listener, that is kind of puzzling as to why there's not more of it. And so, yeah, marker definitely is an influence, but I think you need to think about what it means to do that just with audio. And I suppose part of what I've tried to do is precisely that, is to produce this landscape of intensity, right? Where it's not like you're told something and then something else happens and then something else happens and it all fits together. You have to make the effort to piece it together yourself, just like I'm trying to piece it together, just like Templeton's assistant's trying to understand what Templeton's doing, and just like Stilwell is at the end of her life, like trying to piece together all these different pieces of the puzzle. So yeah, exactly. I think there should be more, absolutely. And Steve has just produced this Astro Darien piece, which goes in a very different direction. And one thing that we were talking about, and I guess it's up to you to tell me whether I succeeded in this, but we were saying, it was actually quite difficult for us as, I guess, kind of the second generation. Like On Vanishing Land is huge for me. I think it's an amazing piece of work. And in a sense, we're kind of working in the shadow of that. And what we have to do is to do something different. But On Vanishing Land was already had precursors in the way that we used speech in CCRU, the kind of like when we would do presentations with audio and so on. But it's very important. I was talking to Steve about this and just saying what's really important is that it doesn't become a genre, like where we just produce more and more of this stuff that has the same kind of mood and the same kind of speech as On Vanishing Land or London Under London. So yeah, I mean it calls for experimentation, but I think the field is so wide open for it.
I guess that's similar to the notion of theory fiction more generally, right? I guess there's maybe I guess it depends on your perspective, but I think especially since you put up the Urbanomic Reader, the kind of awareness of that as a genre has kind of proliferated a lot more. But then maybe to what extent it's become more known and therefore sort of more defined.
Yeah.
There's docufiction maybe is in the. There's always a risk of the same thing happening, but yeah, you know.
I think there's something interesting happening, isn't there? Like, there's all these different forms of fiction appearing, and also a kind of cross-media, cross-pollination. one way to think about it is I think about Kojo Eshin's concept of sonic fiction, right? Is that when he invented that phrase, he kind of pinpointed something that I'd always found incredibly compelling in listening to music. It's like this creation of a world. And I remember most of all him talking about Wu-Tang Clan and the way in which they like mushed together all of this weird stuff, like superheroes, martial arts, the streets of Staten Island, and like somehow, and like gangster films, and somehow like smushed it all together so it made it's this consistent world where all of these things were happening at once. And obviously like the audio, like the music, the loops played a part in creating this world. And so in a sense, like that's coming from music into world creation and fiction creation, and the audio essay is coming the other way. It's like coming from text and trying to build a world that would be worthy of that kind of sonic fiction. So there's maybe like a continuum between all of these different things.
Is there maybe also a sense that you're all kids that grew up on Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds?
Maybe, yeah, that could be part of it. Patrick Keeler, that's right, Simon's saying. Patrick Keeler's London films. Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of influences, I suppose. For me, it's more of an atmosphere. With this particular piece, it's more just like, I guess it is the same thing of like trying to put together all of these different disparate influences and make it into something that seems like it stands up in its own right. I also, one of the things that I love most of all is that Chill Out album by KLF. I don't know why I'm thinking of that, but that, like listening to something that is not quite music and has this long form, somehow that's always been a model for me. And it also is one of these things where they're putting in all of these strange elements that don't really fit together, but it produces a world that absolutely just belongs to it and to nothing else. And also I listened to a lot of Sherlock Holmes audiobooks on cassette when I was a kid, so that's definitely part of it too.
I guess unless we've got any further questions, and
would you want to say a word or two about your how you got Peter Malinka?
Oh yeah, right.
And
yeah. Let me just say something about the image here. This is not doctored.
Yeah.
This is a real thing, like just outside Dunwich, the Frogs Crossing. These are like all the things that, looking back at this, just like reminds me of so many funny moments. Because like when I describe it, it really was a delirious journey. And a lot of those things that happen in the Templeton narrative, like Mark falling asleep in the car and then like suddenly waking up when we arrived in Dunwich. The pigs, we were like driving down these roads where there's all these pigs in these like half-cylinder houses.
They're still there, by the way.
Yeah, and Mark's like pigvits. And then we went to Orford. I think after we interviewed Stuart Bacon, we found this smokery, and we like bought a smoked ham hock and ate it on top of this little hill, like looking out to sea. And there's all these weird things like, so the Frogs Crossing was one that we just laughed about endlessly. And also in Dunwich Museum, there's this animatronic smuggler, which was like super uncanny, that Mark absolutely loved. So yeah, that's just, the Frogs Crossing is a real thing. Sorry, what were you asking, Amy?
The voice
actors,
because you've got some quite famous...
Okay, I started off like basically asking friends and people in CCIU, will you do voices for this? And as I said, like no one ever answered the emails. So Peter Marinka is an amazing actor. He does a lot of voice work. But Peter, so this is the voice of Templeton's assistant. He was also in the film Labyrinth as a goblin. He was in Judge Dredd. And most excitingly for me, he did voiceovers for the TV series Monkey. So he's like an amazing seasoned actor. He was actually in Z-Cars as well in the 60s. And I first met Peter in the Calder Bookshop. So in London, the Calder Bookshop is kind of like a theatre bookshop. And I don't know, I'm not sure how I found out about this, but in the back room there, every so often, they'd have a little gathering of actors and they would read Beckett. And Peter would put on his bowler hat and he has kind of craggy face and he'd read. I just remember him as being an amazing reader of Beckett. And so I worked with him for the project that I did in Bergen, the Ultimate Yarn work. He did some voiceovers for a video I made for that. And so I definitely thought I want to work with him again. And I just think the quality of his voice is like so amazing. And obviously this is all like, the whole aesthetic of this is all super English, and I didn't want to try and pretend it wasn't. I just thought, just like go for it completely. And then, so I discovered Phillida, who does Stillwell's voice. She works with the same agency, Susie Wotton's voice agency. She's been in various stuff, like she was in Tales of the Unexpected. She did a long stint in Emmerdale Farm. And it was great to work with her as well. Great. Yeah, she did an amazing job of like getting her mouth around all of those like twisted syllables, and yeah. So I don't know if I doubt they're listening, but if they are, I'd like to thank them hugely for their input, and also Penny, who did the engineering at Goldsmith Studio. It was actually Phillida was recorded in at Goldsmiths. Yeah, so yeah, eventually it just seemed like I just think it adds a whole new level of sonic texture to it to have those voices, and it's also really nice to like hear your words spoken with conviction by someone else. Yeah. I'd also like to thank the YouTube channel Adam is Cool and Stuff, which is what taught me how to make Markatron. There's like a 15-year-old kid, I think, but he's very, very useful indeed, his YouTube videos.
How do you feel now that you've let go of this after?
It feels great. Yeah, as soon as I had, like I said, like I have some faculty in me that's able to recognize when something is, something holds together, let's say. Like I'm not saying it's the best it could possibly be, but it's like all of the bits are clinging together in the right way, and they're all like smoothed off at the right points, and they're sticking out jaggedly at the right points, and I can turn it around and think that it's done. And it was great to reach that point. I wouldn't have done it without Matt having given me a deadline and given me an opportunity to do something with it. And on such a great occasion as well, like to do it as part of this yearly tribute or commemoration, I think is perfectly apt. To be honest, I just felt really, really sad and awful about the fact that I said I was going to do it and I hadn't. I said to myself I was going to do it and I hadn't. I said to other people I'm working on this thing, and then like 3 years later, nothing. I promised Mark that I'd do it and I hadn't. So it's a massive weight off me to share it, and also, you know, I hope that it's faithful enough to the CCRU legacy that people who like that stuff will like this too. And it'll, you know, it'll just like add another layer or another component to that world.
Do you feel like you've finished the project that you both set out to do in 2001?
No. That project would never have worked. Like, because we weren't professional. Like, we didn't know what we were doing. We don't know how to make a documentary. But I think if we'd kept working on it, then it would have probably turned out something like this. Yeah. I can't think of any part of it that Mark would have like said no to, but I'm sure he would have, on the other hand, you know, he would have had many other things to add that would have made it better. So, I don't know. Is that it? Is it finished now?
We can wrap up there.
Yeah. Unless anyone's got anything else.
Thank you so much for throwing. Yeah, people do only have any final questions. Now is the time. I guess if as a final moment, I just wanted to say thanks again for coming and sharing this with us. And I guess a lot of people have been asking, will this be available afterwards? I think we've said that it will leave this up for over the weekend, people to listen back. Yeah. But then you may be doing something else with it.
Yeah, I hope.
The line, so.
Yeah. So as I said originally, in the same spirit as Mark always talked about on Vanishing Land, I kind of all the time had cherished the hope that for the first time it would be shown or played in a real space with people, and obviously there's many reasons why that isn't very viable or possible, but I hope that it will be in the future. And you know, I'd like to take some time to see whether there's something that we can do with it. So it definitely will be back in some form, but yeah, it's just making the brief appearance here.
Yeah, that was always the intention, I guess we should say, that we had hoped that this would be in person, but the Omicron just made it impossible to plan.
Yeah.
But I mean, if something, we may be planning something in person this year, and we'd certainly love to have you back to give us another airing. So look out for that.
And also the jungle remix as well.
Yeah.
Did you? I don't know if even Lisa didn't notice this, but there are actually some amens in there as well. Just like to say, in case anyone thought that I'd forgotten, they are there. They're heavily disguised, but they're in there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Lots of thank yous and congrats and cheers in the chat.
Thank
you
much
for everyone who's tuned in. And hopefully we will see and hear this all again sometime in the not too distant future in Meet Space. But until then,
thank you.
Thanks.
See you again.
Bye. Bye.